Okay, my name's Brandon Brown, and I'm a pediatric radiologist at Riley Hospital, and thank you all for being here today. I'm going to continue on our theme, of course, but I'm also hoping to take a little bit of a different approach to some of the topics you guys have maybe already heard about. Dealing with culture, that's the central theme of this talk. What is it? Why is it valuable? How can it help us deal with the problems that face physicians today? So, this seems to be not my best mouse ever. Maybe I should just stay at the podium like I'm supposed to. Okay, so, we all know that there's bad news and that physicians are stressed out. And that's not a secret, and it's been discussed and reported on extensively. We know that doctors are stressed and they claim to be burned out, and a lot of doctors say they would never want their children to go into medicine, which is kind of a sad thing, really. But we know there's a problem with practicing physicians. We also know that there's a problem with training physicians. So, about 2 years ago, there was an online survey of several thousand medical students, and these were the results that were published. Burnout and stress, 54% feel burned out. Nearly that many doubt the ability to be a good physician. 82% at one time or another have considered leaving medical school. I thought that was kind of a shocking statistic, 82%. So it's not just practicing physicians, it's physicians in training who are worried too. This middle statistic, doubt ability to be a good physician, there's been a lot of reporting on that recently, not just in medical school, but beyond. And some people refer to it as imposter syndrome. Have you guys heard about this? Imposter syndrome? It's the idea that you find yourself in the hospital on the wards, or maybe in an anatomy exam, and you look around and you say, all these people belong here. They're smart, they're capable, they're supposed to be here, and I'm a fraud. Nobody realizes that I'm not at the same caliber as the rest of this crowd, and I feel like I'm hiding a secret every time I go on the wards, every time I, present a patient during rounds. I feel like I'm just about to be discovered for the fraud that I am. And people report feeling this way long after training, long after they've become fully practicing faculty physicians, even when they have leadership positions. It's a really interesting phenomenon, but it's, I think it's part of this doubt ability to be a good physician problem. And then we have the classic descriptions of burnout. This is the Maslach criteria, the instrument that they use to examine how burned out you really are. So anytime you see that administered, most of the questions fall into one of these three categories. Either you're emotionally exhausted, or you're depersonalized, meaning you don't connect with people, colleagues or patients. You don't look at a patient as a human being. You look at them as an extra amount of work, or just a task that needs to be checked off your to-do list. Or lack of personal accomplishment. In other words, the work that I'm doing doesn't seem to be making a difference. It probably doesn't even matter if I show up today. That's what these things are supposed to mean. And so that we have official, validated survey instruments to find out just exactly how stressed out people are. And we know that mistreatment is a part of it. More and more medical students, as they graduate, are describing varying degrees of mistreatment by physicians. And it would be silly for us to pretend like those are unrelated problems, right? On the one hand, we've got burned out physicians, and in completely unrelated news, we've got medical students being mistreated. Obviously, they're linked. And it ranges from, really common things like being embarrassed. I mean, we could probably all think of a time when we've been embarrassed in front of our peers, to really, rare but terrible things like threatened with physical harm. Hopefully nobody falls into that category in this room. So, we know that students feel like they're being mistreated, and some people have described the dilemma of trainees and stress at work in terms of this phrase, the hidden curriculum. Maybe some of you guys have heard of that or seen that, the hidden curriculum. It's the idea that we practice differently than we preach, right? That's kind of a well-known phenomenon, and we try not to do that. We try to practice what we preach, but in reality, what you're taught, what the medical school says is the official curriculum, what is in the handbook you're given at the beginning of the course might not be what you're actually learning every day on the floor in the hospital. In fact, maybe some of the sources of stress at work come from this hidden curriculum. So the sweet spot of this Venn diagram, the orange triangle, that's where everything all comes together. What we're supposed to teach is what we're actually teaching is what you're learning. But look at all this white area over here. This is the hidden curriculum. It's stuff that you're learning implicitly or without it being officially stated. And that could have a big role to play in work-related stress. And some people just feel as though it's a symptom of the way medicine is trending. Right? What's this a picture of? Fast food, yeah, maybe McDonald's, that'd be a safe guess. So one idea behind the trend of medicine towards efficiency and towards focusing on metrics like number of patients seen, how short can you make that outpatient clinic appointment, how quickly can you move volume through. Some people would say that that's a trend towards commoditization in medicine. In other words, we don't really care about individuality in the medical care that's being delivered. We want it to be reproducible and uniform, so we want to make the job as foolproof as possible, just like this assembly line at a fast food restaurant. In other words, we can't trust anyone to put the whole hamburger together because they might mess it up. So we're going to break it down into these interchangeable units, like you're the ketchup squirter, and you're the pickle placer, and you put the top bun on, right? And it doesn't really matter who you are as an individual. You just got to keep putting that bun on, and if you don't show up to work today, no problem. We can easily replace you with somebody else to put the top bun on. And people have described feeling stressed because they feel like their job is being commoditized. Some people might even say that a lot of the roles in medicine are being turned into these discrete, easily reproducible units, and there's not room for self-expression or people living out what they might see as their calling, to practice medicine, to care for the weak and vulnerable. So, there's all these official criteria that you see in survey instruments, like the things that we discussed, but I think that related to all of them, and maybe even contributing to all of them, is this idea of isolation. And there's a lot of discussion and literature that describes the interplay between what we call stress at work, or even burnout, and isolation, that we're emotionally exhausted because we feel isolated, but then we become even more isolated in response to the emotional exhaustion. It's kind of like a death spiral, right? Same thing for these other categories. So isolation is a topic that I'm very interested in, and I think is related to the idea of culture. And that's what I want to focus on today, because I think it's both the beginning and the end of our problem. And I want to propose a slightly different approach on how we can address the problem of being stressed out at work. It seems to me that most of the time when we talk about burnout or stress, we take one of two approaches. And the first would be to focus on the individual person who's stressed out and to try to direct our interventions or our solutions towards them as an individual. In other words, you need to just eat right. You're stressed out because you're not eating right, you haven't had enough probiotics and vegetables, and by the way, you should probably run on the treadmill. In fact, we're going to put a treadmill really close to the front door of medical school, so you don't forget about treadmills, right? I'm being a little bit facetious because obviously eating right is important, and bad diets can contribute to the way you feel, and the same thing goes for exercise, but it feels a little superficial to think that the conditions that we're discussing can be so easily remedied. But a lot of the time we talk about individual level interventions, and those are necessary, but definitely not sufficient. It's almost like we're saying there's a war in the hospital. It's a battlefield out there, people, and you need stronger armor. And so the way we're going to help you prepare for battle is to give you stronger armor. It doesn't really answer the question of why is the hospital a battlefield. It doesn't ask, why do you have to go into war? every day when you go to work on the floor. But it gives you stronger armor. And there's limits to that, especially because it's a little bit like saying, if you're really stressed out, it's kind of your own fault, right? If you just eaten Activia yogurt this morning, you know? I don't want to, victim blame, but you could have done a better job, right? There's limits to that approach. What other ways do we address burnout? Top down. We need to get the president, the dean, to make the right rules. If only we had the right institutions with the right laws, problem solved. And so we just need to elect the right person. We think this way with politics too, right? If we only had the right senator, the right governor, the right president, wouldn't life be perfect? And in fact, we're going to make the world a better place by electing the perfect person next time. We say that a lot, every 4 years, right? So this is the top-down approach, and it says, we need to get a CEO to pay attention to our problems. And just like the individual approach, I think there's a lot of merit to this, because people describe stress at work stemming from things like loss of autonomy. I don't feel like I can go in and do what I've trained to do, what I'm prepared to do. I can't share, what I have to offer because I'm being handcuffed every day at work. I'm being told what I must do and how quickly I must see patients and how many patients I must see. And it really limits my ability to heal. People feel that way. And we can help them by maybe diminishing or removing those handcuffs. So I don't mean to say that that's wrong. It's not wrong. It's necessary. But I still don't think it's sufficient because I'm not the CEO of the hospital, and neither are you, right? I'm not the dean of the medical school. So if I get too focused on this, what do? Well, nothing. It's not my problem, right? I can't fix it. So it's a little bit of an invitation. If we think this is the way, then it's an invitation to disengage with this concern. The future of our profession is at stake. We don't want to be washing our hands of it and saying, thank goodness the CEOs are going to fix this problem for us. So important, but not the whole story. So what's a third option? What else is there? There's the individual. There's leadership. Where else can we go with this? And I think that one maybe slightly more neglected aspect of how we can restore joy in our work is to focus on the community that we live in, the culture that we exist in, the people that we see every day and work with and help and offer our mentorship to and receive mentorship from. And so I want to spend the rest of the time telling you why, first discussing what it is and then telling you why I think it's important for these 4 reasons: interdependence, perspective, adversity, and anti-fragility. I don't even know if that's a word, but anyway, it's in the presentation. Okay, so what is culture? That's a tough one. We could spend a lot of time talking about it. I just want to give you a 3-point outline of what I think is important in the concept of culture. Does anybody recognize this image? It's an etching by Escher, the artist who does the Never-Ending Staircase. It's kind of like the stuff that was featured in that Christopher Nolan film about dreams. Inception, yeah, right, exactly. So this is an etching he did of the Tower of Babel. You guys probably know that story, right? The ancient civilization tries to build a monument to human ingenuity, to engineering, to our technology and its abilities. And so they build a tower that's going to reach up to heaven. And what happens? It's a total failure. Not a failure because we lacked sufficient technology, not a failure because we didn't have smart enough engineers, not a failure because it was too early in civilization. It was a failure because we couldn't talk to each other. Best engineers, best technology failed because we couldn't talk to each other. And that could be us in medicine today. We've got great technology. We've got artificial intelligence, right? How could it get any better than that? We could fail. And I think that culture depends upon us knowing how to talk to each other and doing it and talking to each other. What else is culture? What does it mean to have a vibrant and active culture? I think it requires us to think in terms of collegiality. That's different than being a coworker. A coworker is somebody you incidentally happen to coexist with. You know, her cubicle's next to mine. We're coworkers. We happen to pass each other on the way in the front door every morning as we swipe our ID badge. Collegiality is different. It implies a level of connection that means we're pursuing the same goal. We are part of something bigger than ourselves, and we can't accomplish it without each other. I can do my best. I can be the best I can be, and it won't be enough. I need you. And vice versa, right? So collegiality is a special kind of relationship. I mean, I imagine everyone in this room thinks of themselves as going into a profession, not just a job. And I imagine that you think there might be something different between practicing the profession of medicine and, I don't know, repairing a transmission on a motor vehicle. There's nothing against repairing transmissions, but I think that we tell ourselves in medicine that we're engaged in a special kind of calling, and that we're professing something. You know, you're going to get your degree and you're going to publicly be committing to certain ideals and certain obligations, and that means something. So we're colleagues, we're not just coworkers. And if you want to live in a culture, if you want to participate in a community, you have to think about the people around you as colleagues, not as coworkers. What else does it take to build a culture? This is a poet, essayist that I really admire, Wendell Berry. He's actually a farmer in Kentucky a lot of the time. And that's him receiving the Jefferson Award from President Barack Obama a few years ago. That's the highest award given by the National Endowment for the Humanities. For many things, a whole career of writing fiction and nonfiction, for working for ecological causes and various other endeavors. But he spends a lot of time writing about culture, both what makes a culture and what it takes to have a culture and what contributes to the breakdown of culture. And he thinks that it has a lot to do with trust. This is a quote from one of his essays entitled "The Work of Local Culture." It says, "A good culture ensures itself by trust, by good faith and goodwill, by mutual help." So we all need to ask ourselves, is that a description of our everyday work environment? Is that what it's like, going to class, going to the hospital, doing rounds every morning? You know, trust, good faith, and goodwill, and mutual help. And if it's not, would we want it to be what our reality is like? He spends a lot of time arguing that you can't properly care for human beings unless you have affection for them, which sounds kind of touchy-feely, right? But what he means, I think, is that there's something immediate and real about having affection, which comes from knowing people. You know, when I hear that 3,000 miles away there was a tornado and X number of people died, I might pause and say to myself, that's too bad. But it doesn't profoundly affect me in the way that it might if my next door neighbor died in a car crash. Or even worse, if my child died in a terrible accident. Not because I think that some human lives are more valuable than others, I would never sign up for that, but because I don't have the same connection with people that are not in my community, that are not part of the same culture as me, and you can't properly care about other human beings unless you have affection for them. So he would suggest that we need to exist in a culture of people that we have affection for and that have affection for us. I'm not suggesting that we all date coworkers, but I think we need to know and care about the people, not just rub shoulders with them on the way in and out the front door. So that's what we want to accomplish. What's it going to do for burnout, though? You know, why is this something to discuss when we're talking about work-related stress? Well, a couple of reasons. Number one, it reminds us of our interdependence. It doesn't remind us that we should be interdependent. It reminds us that we are interdependent. Anybody recognize that image? It's in Spain. Catalonia. Those are the Castellers of Catalonia. It's a little hard to tell from this bird's eye view, but in the center there where you see all those outstretched arms, those are people physically supporting one another, holding each other up, lifting each other up, being lifted up. There's a Castell. The Castellers of Catalonia build human towers. The United Nations has called this event, an annual event, a masterpiece of intangible humanity. I thought, masterpieces of humanity were like the Great Pyramid at Giza or St. Paul's Cathedral in London. But people are suggesting this is a masterpiece of the intangible heritage of humanity. There's no rappelling gear. There's no straps or harnesses. People are building these towers. They do it at a festival every year for hundreds of years, and they go really high, sometimes 10 courses of human beings high. That sounds foolish and dangerous, right? Why in the world would you do that? It turns out to not be as dangerous as you'd think. Since they've been recording outcomes for this, there's only been 2 major catastrophes ever. Every year they do it dozens and dozens of times over. And it requires an incredible, not just athletic ability, but trust. These are people who have to know each other and care about what happens to each other, not just because they're generous people, but because the outcome affects them too, right? If you're in the middle of that tower, you're both supporting and being supported. And this primarily started as an exercise in community building. This region in Spain, these villages felt that they needed to reinforce the sense that they belong to each other by physically building towers of human beings. It's kind of hard to even put ourselves in that situation. But it's a pretty remarkable thing, and it involves a lot of trust. What do you guys hear when you think about trusting in medical school, in the hospital? Depending upon someone else. It's a little bit scary. If you're anything like me, you think trust, that sounds a lot like risk. I can't risk anything, right? I've got to graduate. I've got to pass my, board exams. Group project? What do you mean group project? I can't trust that he's going to do his part. That's way too risky. I got to do it all myself because we all know that if you want something done right, you got to do it yourself. That's kind of how we practice, how we educate ourselves in medical school. Have you guys ever heard the phrase, you don't have to outswim the shark, you just have to outswim your buddy? What an awful thing for us to say. But that's kind of the way that we train and prepare ourselves for practice. It's all on you. You're sailing a ship of one. And trust is just not something that factors in. That's a problem if that's how we're preparing or practicing medicine, both because it leads to breakdowns that affect ourselves, but our patients are assuming that we're working as a team, that we're trusting each other, that we're depending upon one another. That's the presumption when a patient comes into the hospital. They don't lay there in bed and say, gosh, I really hope my physicians can get along today. Or if they are worrying about that, that's pretty dysfunctional, right? So interdependence is an important consequence and result of living and practicing in a community, in a vibrant culture. What else? Culture can remind us of perspectives that aren't our own. Anybody know who that is? The 6th president of the United States? John Quincy Adams. Yes, that's exactly who it is. He is not now, nor ever has been known as the finisher. Please don't misconstrue this slide. That would be a cool nickname, but I just don't think that that's been given to him. But I think his story is really important. He spent a large amount of his career after being president. So usually we think of gradations, right? Your local government, maybe then your state governor, then Senate, then president. You don't go backwards. He went backwards. He went back to the U.S. House of Representatives after he was president and spent a big chunk of his career fighting for causes, not as president, but as, a lowly congressman. And one of his biggest pet projects, one of his hardest fought battles, was abolition. Which is weird, right? Because you guys all went to school and learned about American history and the Civil War, and John Quincy Adams probably didn't come up that much. And that's because he was dead by the time the Civil War happened. But he was very engaged with the British attempt and ultimately successful passage of abolition, which happened well before ours. And he was very taken by the speeches and arguments of William Wilberforce, who was kind of like the main driving politician behind abolition in England. So he listened to all of these speeches by Wilberforce, and he would come back here to America and try and, do the same thing and replicate it, and he would go at length every day in the House of Representatives, making speech after speech after speech. They actually passed a law just for the purpose of getting him to shut up, because the rest of the House of Representatives was so tired of hearing him rail against this. There was nowhere near a consensus to actually pass any laws. So it was just, the same thing, different day. He actually had a massive stroke in the U.S. House of Representatives while he was giving a speech, which, he ultimately died from a few days later, and accomplished nothing. Zero passage of laws, even working closer towards abolition. Nothing. In fact, when he died in 1848, it looked like the U.S. was going the other way. There were new states coming into the Union, propagating slavery. There were more and more and greater divisions about it. And he died, and even it was recorded that he spoke to his family in the last few weeks of his life feeling like a failure. Why? Not because he was a failure, but because he lacked the perspective that we have. What perspective do we have? Well, we have the perspective of history, and the message is we don't always get to witness the effects of our effort. Because he died in 1848, which just happened to be the first year of another U.S. congressman who only spent a couple years in the House of Representatives, but went on to be so moved by the speeches of John Quincy Adams, wrote later in his career that this was one of the most powerful influences on his thinking and on his behavior. So by ourselves, we don't always get to be the finisher, and we can't always see the effect of our work, and we're pretty bad judges, to be honest with you, about what we have and haven't accomplished, and what good we have or have not done in the world, because we've got a limited perspective. Living in a culture, in a community, can help with that, because we surround ourselves, or we should surround ourselves, with enough diverse perspectives that it doesn't just depend upon our perspective. There are other people there who are finishing for us, and we're finishing for other people. That happens in the hospital too. One of the most self-reported, stressed out medical specialties. Any guesses? Always tops the list, or near the top. Really high energy, high intensity. Emergency medicine, right, yeah, emergency medicine is frequently at the top of lists of physicians reporting stress. And one of the things they complain about is they don't usually get to be the finisher. They start a lot of medical care. They save a lot of lives. They perform a lot of critical interventions, but they don't always get to have that follow-up where the patient comes back and says, I just want you to know, thank you so much for being part of my care and sticking with me, because it's a fast-paced environment. People keep moving through. And if that's all they ever saw, if they never talked to any other physicians, if they never had any other perspectives, it would be pretty easy for them to think, man, we aren't making a bit of good, a bit of difference in this world. Because every day, more sick, banged up people roll through the front door. It's like, geez, what the heck, So we need to have the benefit of perspective that surrounding ourselves with a diverse community and culture can bring. Why else is this important for stress in work, stress in medicine? Well, because our lives are going to be dealing with adversity. It's not a question of how can we, manage our career so we don't encounter adversity, right? That's not on the table. It's going to happen. We know that it can't be avoided and it's a part of our life. So what's culture got to do with it? Well, we're physicians, and we're as likely as anybody else to think that we're kind of pretty capable, right? We can manage. We can figure it out. We can be invincible. And being part of a community reminds us that we're not invincible precisely when we need to be reminded of it. This is not like a deep revelation. It's just being honest with ourselves. When we recognize the importance of other people to our own success, that's just honesty. That's not brilliance, really. And yet it's really hard for a lot of people to do. Adversity brings out a reminder of what is actually just our human condition. This is the British poet John Donne. You guys may have heard of him for saying things like, no man is an island, or, ask not for whom the bell tolls. He also said that adversity in isolation compounds the effect. So we're going to encounter adversity. That's guaranteed. The isolation part is not guaranteed. And there's a big difference between suffering alone and suffering in community. He also said, every death diminishes me because I'm part of mankind. That is a realization of interconnectedness of human beings. That's a realization that we depend upon each other and others need us as much as we need them. And that when there's suffering or death in the hospital, that affects us. We're not depersonalized from that. If we think of ourselves as an island, yeah, you can easily slip into a depersonalized mode where you just got your checklist to complete. But when you're thinking about the effect of human beings on one another, it's very hard to engage in that depersonalization. Every death diminishes us, like a fabric that's being slowly torn away. John Donne says that's us. So how are we going to respond to adversity? That's the core idea here that John Donne wrote about, that we're all concerned with, because we know it's going to happen. Even if we have the best career, the best training, the best profession or subspecialty, we know that there's going to be adversity. So the problem response is collapse. That's kind of the idea of burnout. Then there's stoicism, resilience, and this idea that I mentioned earlier, anti-fragility. So collapse is what we don't want, and that's what we recognize is happening more and more. That's what we're all concerned about. That's what we're trying to respond to. The idea that it's just too much, that we can't bear the burden. And that's not desirable on anyone's count. Stoicism sometimes is advocated. It's this idea that you just need to tough it out. Maybe you might even say that's the traditional model. Yeah, med school's hard. Yeah, there's going to be some pimping on rounds, and maybe you'll work some 36-hour shifts. But, you just got to toughen up. That's Epictetus, a famous Stoic. A summary of all of Epictetus's writings might be to say, grin and bear it. Life's going to bring you ups and downs, vicissitudes, right? Stuff's going to happen. You can't help it, so you might as well just deal with it. Just live with it. That's not bad, but it seems insufficient. Seems insufficient to me if we want to thrive in our careers. What about resilience? That sounds pretty good. And there's different ways to interpret the word resilience. But I think on a very literal level, it might mean something like survival, weathering the storm, bouncing back, encountering an obstacle, taking a hit, and then returning to the place that you were before you encountered the obstacle. That'd be great, right? I'd be happy if somebody said, Brandon Brown, that's a pretty resilient physician. I'd feel good about that. But I want to suggest to you guys that there might even be one other level of response. This idea of anti-fragility. Every time you hear about resilience, every time I hear about resilience, I feel like there's a picture of a parched landscape with a single flower, or a huge asphalt, parking lot with a single plant through a crack, so I just felt like I had to include it. That flower, that dandelion is so resilient. But anti-fragility, what does that mean? I think it means something like to thrive. So that's the final reason why. Anti-fragility. What am I even talking about? And what does it mean? It's a concept that was probably pre-existing before this guy. This is Nassim Taleb. He's a Lebanese, he was an economist and financial guru, and then he kind of turned to essayist and thinker about things like risk and decisions and how we respond to uncertainty in life. But he really made the idea popular. He's written a book, in fact, titled Anti-Fragility. And he says that what we want is not resilience. What we want is to actually become stronger through the process of encountering adversity. Not just to return to where we were before we got hit, but to come back better than ever. Which sounds a little ambitious, right? Is that wishful thinking? That we're actually going to be strengthened by adversity. He doesn't think so, and I wonder, there might be some examples in our own field where stress can lead to strength. What am I showing you guys here? Oh wait, I have prizes. I forgot. What am I showing you guys here? That's a quick answer. I have to give you that. Yeah, I told you that I work in radiology, so I couldn't resist showing a radiograph of a femur, and that's actually a cross-sectional view of an actual bone. Yeah, prize winner. Why am I showing that? Can stress lead to strength? Anybody know what I'm getting at? Yeah. We lay down calcium along lines of stress. That's true. Yeah. And in fact, the opposite states it even more dramatically. If we don't have stress on our bones, we cannot have normal bones. That's a picture of an astronaut at the International Space Station. What does every astronaut have to do when they get back from a tour of duty on the International Space Station? They have to go see a medical practitioner. Which one? PT, physical therapy. That's exactly right. We don't just survive the effects of gravity. Our bones depend upon it. They can't be normal without it. And the space station is not a normal place for a human being to be. So all of those trabeculae, all of that bone inside the neck of the femur that you see, that is only possible with the stress of walking and gravity. And if we don't do those things, if we don't stress our bones, we end up with demineralized bones, osteopenic bones, even fractured bones, right? So eventually, we start to break down all of the connections without stress. And I think there might be a metaphor for us in medicine, the less adversity we encounter, the less obstacles, we start to think, I've got this figured out. I don't really need other people. I mean, I'm a pretty nice person, so I'm happy to help you, but it's out of the goodness of my heart. I don't need anybody else, right? Things are going well. It's tempting to start to think that way. It's when we encounter adversity that we remember the connections, and it's the connections that make us strong. This image, all of those interconnected fibers, kind of remind me of this. I don't know if you guys agree or not. But those connections are the source of our strength. They're not incidental to our strength. And it's at our own peril if we forget about them. They disappear, right? So can we move beyond resilience, survival, a good thing, no doubt, to actually become stronger through stress? Can we become anti-fragile, like the human skeleton? The first part of it is recognizing our vulnerability. Not achieving some sort of virtue in it, but just being honest with ourselves. That's just self-awareness. We need to be more self-aware and realize who we are and what our actual condition is. And the only way we can respond to that vulnerability is with other human beings. We can't build a defense against vulnerability with an army of one, right? It requires a culture, a community that we have to cultivate. So what can we do? How can we ensure that we are in a place amongst people who are part of a vibrant culture? one thing we need to be doing is introducing ourselves and others into a culture that has contributions from many different places. That's what diversity is, or at least one definition of diversity is the idea of introducing a culture to a new audience so that you end up with something at the end that has contributions from many diverse sources. And we need to seek out people to surround ourselves with who are in an active and thriving culture. If you're looking for where to do the next line on your CV, if you're looking for where to get a residency or a fellowship or a partnership as a practicing physician, seek out people who are in an active and thriving culture, who recognize that they need one another to succeed, who see colleagues, not coworkers. Just being in a place where there are intelligent people is not enough. Capable people is not enough, because that's a vulnerable place. That's a place that ends up with things like work-related stress and burnout. You need to be in a place where people don't just have a safety net of each other, but see that as the regular working conditions. That's the day-to-day way that we practice medicine. And if you don't have enough to surround yourself with, you could be the one that creates some of that culture, that starts to remind the people around you that you depend upon them. You know, that tells the people that they see on rounds every day, thanks for helping me do my job. I can't actually become the physician I want to be without you. That's a humbling thing to say. That's not the kind of thing you say when you're feeling really good about your own abilities, but it's the most honest thing you could say. So why do we need culture? We need it because it reminds us of our interdependence, which is just our true human condition. It gives us perspective far beyond what we could ever see on our own. It helps us to encounter adversity, not just bouncing back, but actually becoming stronger than we were before, and maybe even anti-fragile. And I just want to leave you guys with this quote that I read earlier. But I want you to think about, does it describe your place of work, what you come to every morning? And if not, what's it going to take to make it your place of work? Thanks very much. Anybody have any questions? Yes.
I thought that was great. I thought that was a great description of the why, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the how.
Right, how can we create culture in our lives and in our workplace? That is, I think, going to depend upon three things, at least, maybe more than three. One is all of our abilities to be honest with ourselves about who we are. We spend so much time building a CV because we have to. That's how you get to the next step. We spend so much time trying to find out which name in the author order that we're going to be, and whether we got to a position that's ranked third or fourth or fifth or first on the U.S. News and World Report, that we don't have a lot of time left over to look around us and say, whose career can I enable today? And if you're waiting until you're well established in your career to start thinking about that, it's going to be too late. You'll already have kind of formed the habit of, building your CV, which is not bad, it's necessary. But if it's the first thing on our list every day, it's a problem. So I think one thing on the how is we all need to spend a lot less minutes each day thinking of ourselves. Number two, I think that we need to be willing to have a attitude, and for me it's in the reading room, for other physicians it's on the wards, that we need to practice medicine as a team. So we spend a lot of time training to be individuals, and we think of ourselves as getting where we've gotten mostly through our own hard work and mostly through our own efforts. I mean, I studied a lot of hours for my boards, and you guys probably did too, and that deserves credit. But the reality is that we didn't get to where we are on our own. And we can't continue to progress in isolation. So I think we need to start thinking about medicine as a team sport, and not just thinking about it, but living that. So, I feel like there's a lot of lip service towards that. But in reality, when we actually practice, physicians spend a lot of time on their own. And maybe they don't even see each other. They don't even make contact except in the electronic medical record. The physician lounge. Who goes to a physician lounge anymore? They don't even exist in some hospitals. Just the idea that you would incidentally interact with your colleagues on a regular basis as part of the way you do your work has gotten kind of weaned away because we don't have time. We're so busy, and there's so much emphasis on all the stuff we haven't yet done today. So I think the second thing that we really need is to practice thinking about ourselves as part of a team, not as a solo practitioner. And then the third thing that we need to do is we need to look at the things that we didn't like in the environment in which we came up, and don't perpetuate those. There's so much of an emphasis on doing things the way we do it because that's what, how we do it, and that's the way it always has been done, that people get through a really difficult patch in medicine, and then they go on and repeat that same patch, and you can see the cycle being repeated. So we all need to make a conscious effort to think about the patterns that were isolation, that were, ignoring the interconnectedness, and not fall into those same traps just because it's the way we trained. Just because I go through an unpleasant experience in medicine doesn't mean I need to give that to the student under me. That's hard. People tend to repeat the hidden curriculum, the things that they've observed. Kids do it with their parents. Students do it with their teachers. So it takes a lot of focus to not do it. And so those three things I think are a start. But it's a big question, no doubt. Anybody else have any other questions? Okay, well, we're out of time, so I think we have a few minutes before the next speaking, so I'll let you guys go. Thanks again.